Solving quadratic equations. Today we are going to be focused in on the method of using factoring to help solve. So before we can start solving these quadratic equations, we need to have the variables all on the same side. I always move it to where my variable will be my squared term will be positive. So in this case, that means I need to take and move the 10x and the 24 over to the side of the x squared. And that's going to result in a 0 equals, and then everything else on the other side. X squared minus 10x plus 24. Some of you may be at the point where you can do some of the factoring in your head. We are going to go ahead and use the box method the same way we used when we were factoring earlier this year. And the x squared goes in the top corner, the 24 goes down here. Or this is the method that you can use the x to help you with. And so we're looking for the factors that will multiply to give me 24x squared that will add to give me 10. And the first one I think of is negative 6x and negative 4x. You may have had to go through several of them before you see the one that works, as those two will add up to be negative 10 and multiply to give me a positive 24x squared. So I'm going to go ahead and fill that into the chart. And negative 6x. And factor out my like terms. So in my first row, I have an x that's the same. My second row, I have a 6 that will divide into both pieces. I need it to be negative because the closest sign is negative. In my first column, I have an x that factors into both pieces. In my second column, I have a 4, but it needs to be negative because both of those are negative. So I'm going to come over and put 0 equals, and then I'm going to write out my factors. And the first one I have is x minus 6. The second one is x minus 4. And so what this means is something times something else is going to equal 0. Well, that's going to be the only way that's true is if either one of those factors is equal to 0. So we'll solve for x minus 6 equals 0 and x minus 4 equals 0. And so x minus 6 equals 0. You add the 6 to both sides, and you get x equals 6. On x minus 4, add 4 to both sides, and you get x is equal to positive 4. So that means x is equal to 4 and 6. You may also see this in set notation. 4 comma 6. Oops. And I always list these in order from least to greatest. Let's go on to this next one. So in this next one, we have 2x squared plus 11x minus 6, or equals 6. I need to get the 6 moved over to the other side by subtracting. It can't combine with anything else. And so I have my 2x squared plus 11x minus 6 equals 0. Come over and work on my box. $2x squared and negative 6. And I am trying to see when 12x squared will give me a negative 12x squared will give me a sum of a positive 11x. Well, that will happen when I have 12x multiplied times a negative 1x. And so I will plug that up here. Looking at my first row, I have a x that's the same in both. My second row, I have a 6 that will divide into both. And my closest sign is positive. My first column, I have a 2 that divides into both. And an x that will divide into both. In my second column, I have a -1. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to set my factors out. X plus 6 times 2x minus 1 is equal to 0. And this is true when my x plus 6 equals 0, or the 2x minus 1 equals 0. And I'm going to solve both those equations. Subtract the 6. X is equal to -6. Add the 1. 2x is equal to 1. I need to divide both sides by 2. And so x is equal to 1/2, or 0.5. And then so my answer is x equals a -6, comma, a positive 1/2. Or, like I said, if it's a set notation, it'd be a -6, comma, 1/2. Okay, so let's look at this next one. We have 2x squared equals 8x. We have a problem because not everything's on the same side, so we need to move everything to the same side. I'm going to choose to keep my x squared positive, so I'm going to move my 8x over to join. And that gives me 2x squared minus 8x equals 0. Now, I don't have the 3 terms, so I'm not going to use the box method. When we have just 2 terms, you need to look and see, is there a GCF that can factor out to simplify, or is it the difference of squares or the sum or difference of cubes? So looking at these 2 terms, I see that they share a 2x. So I'm going to factor that out, and that 2x squared divided by 2x leaves me just an x. And then a -8x divided by 2x leaves me a -4. So I was able to factor it that way. Now I'm going to set each of those factors equal to 0. So 2x equals 0. And x minus 4 equals 0. And I'm going to solve both those equations. So dividing by 2, x is equal to 0. And then I'm going to add 4. And the other place that's going to make this equation true is whenever x is equal to 4. So when I fill in my set my equation, it's going to be x equals, again, least to greatest, 0, 4. Or we could have written in set notation 0, 4. Now, the other way we can solve some of these equations is if we solve it by graphing. Be careful on this, because if it gives you a decimal and the computer does not want a decimal, it will count it wrong. So the calculator is going to give you a decimal whenever it needs to. And so you need to make sure that you do it by hand when it asks you to factor by hand, because that's the way the answers are going to be looked for. So let's go ahead and start. We have an equation, and step 1 is going to be getting everything to the same side. I'm going to go ahead and move it over to where my r squared side is. And so I'm going to subtract 130, add 4r, subtract 130, add 4r. And I want them in the order that is the most commonly seen, which is your squared term first, your variable by itself next, and the constant last, and that equals 0. Now, I'm going to be solving this by graphing, so I need to convert this over into something I can type into my graphing calculator. Graphing calculator needs to be in the terms of x's and y's. And what we're going to do is we're going to graph the function. So f of x equals 6x squared plus 4x minus 130. And I'm going to graph this into the graphing calculator and come up with my solutions. So we are looking at the graph, and we're going to use our Inspire calculators. This is the one I have on my tablet. We're going to go down and we're going to add in a graph. We're going to type in the equation that we just found. So 6x squared plus 4x minus 130. Now this is our graph. It's zoomed in pretty heavy because there's a lot going on here. And that last number, that negative 130, says that the y-intercept is at negative 130. We're opening up because 6 is positive. Now I'm going to be zooming back in to try to find out what's happening at the zeros, because we're trying to figure out what, in this problem, we're actually looking for what's happening when it crosses the x-axis. So I'm going to get back to where I can see better what's happening on the x-axis. And then we're going to use our tools to help us find the zeros. And so that would be under your menu. And go to menu, and we're going to click on Analyze Graph. And then we're going to go to 0. And it's going to give you a little bar that you have to hover over and highlight. And so we're going to highlight the section that's going to be at the 0. So I'm going to do, I chose to do my one on the right first. And you see how it says 4.33, comma, 5.28 e to the negative 11. That 5.28 or 5.82 e to the negative 11 is just another way of saying 0. So this is at 4.33, comma 0. Now let's do our second one. We're going to do the same process. We're going to highlight the material inside the 0. And it tells me this is at negative 5, comma 0. So my two zeros that came from this problem are at negative 5 and positive 4.33. And so we found that the two zeros are when x equals negative 5 or 4 point, and we're going to round to the two decimal places, 4.33. And this could also be written in set notation as negative 5, comma 4.33. Be careful on the assignment. Some of the questions are going to ask for it in decimal notation, decimal form. Some are going to ask for it in fraction form. And if you give it in the wrong format, it's going to count it wrong.